Okay, well, it's 1 after 12, so I think we will go ahead and get started here. I'm really excited. We're excited to have Carrie Allison with us today. Carrie works for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and she is going to be presenting on bats. And I think this is such a cool topic that a lot of people don't think about, but how important bats are for pollinators. And we have a bat house now, which I'm really excited about. So excited about the presentation today. And thank you so much, Carrie, for coming and doing this for us.
Absolutely, you guys. Thanks for having me. So like Faye said, I am an endangered species biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So we're a federal government agency. We're actually under the Department of the Interior. And our office is in Frankfort, Kentucky. And our one office serves the entire state of Kentucky for any of the federally listed species. We've got a staff of about 10 biologists, and we do everything from recovery of listed species to regulatory, law enforcement, all the fun stuff that goes with federally listed species. But today I'm going to talk particularly muted. We actually spend the majority of our time working with bats in Kentucky, just because the endangered bats in Kentucky are statewide. And so I kind of always like to start out with just a little bit of information about bats in general. So these in this picture, these are Mexican free-tailed bats. Every now and then we'll get a lone Mexican free-tailed bat that ends up in Kentucky, but it's very rare. But this is just a really cool emergence out of a cave that occurs in the Southwest US. Just some general facts about bats. There are actually 1,100 species of bats worldwide, and then we've got 40 species in the US alone. They're pretty small in size, but they have a very large footprint, meaning they actually make up 1/4 of the world's mammals. They can live more than 30 years, which is really impressive for an animal that small. And they can fly up to 60 miles an hour. In fact, and this was pretty recent, we thought this was really cool. In 2016, there was a paper published by the University of Tennessee, and researchers found the Mexican free-tailed bat, which that was the picture that was in the very beginning of the presentation, could actually reach speeds up to 100 miles per hour, making it by far the fastest mammal on Earth. So even faster than the cheetah, some of these bats can move, which is just really impressive for something this small. Let me go back one. So bats find their food using echolocation.
Volume. You gotta shrink here. Exit full screen.
Okay. They find their food in total darkness. They locate insects by, basically it's this inaudible to the human ear, but it's a high-pitched sound of about 10 to 20 beeps per second. And then they listen to the echoes. So you guys have probably heard the saying before, blind as a bat. Truth is, bats aren't actually blind. They can see quite well. And that saying had actually been converted. It used to be blind as a bat in the daylight, because while they are not blind, they do have a hard time seeing during the day, but they have excellent vision at night. I don't know if you guys have seen kind of this little picture that's been floating around the internet for a while with the bats and insects playing Marco Polo. But that's basically how it works. The bat sends out a signal, it bounces off the bat, or it bounces off the insect and comes back to the bat, and the bat's able to figure out where the insect is and flies in, and that's how they catch their prey. They can eat up to 1,200 mosquitoes an hour, and often bats will consume their body weight in insects every night. So it really helps keep a lot of the bug population in check. So a lot of different, not just mosquitoes, but they also eat moths and, several other insects that we consider to be nuisance on, on agricultural crops. But then we also have bats that like to eat fruit and seeds and pollen from flowers. But the majority of the bats that we have in the United States are insectivores, so they eat primarily insects. Most bats, they only have one pup a year. They do not come in these cute little baby bat burritos. That is actually a rescue in Australia, and that's how they keep their baby bats when they're orphaned. They wrap them up in those little claws, and I just feel like if you're trying to make a plea for bats being cute and adorable and not scary, there's no better picture than this one. But bat mothers can actually find their babies among thousands or millions of other bats just by their unique voice and scent. And so when the baby bats are born, a lot of times, depending on what environment they're born in, they're in these huge clusters, and the mothers will go out to feed at night. And when they come back into the cave, they can actually immediately find their baby, despite the fact that there are just thousands of these little baby bats stuck to the roof of the cave. Bat droppings, they gave it a nice name because I guess bat poop didn't sound all that cool. So they call it guano. So whenever you hear somebody talk about guano, it's just bat poop. There's nothing all that great about it, other than the fact that it is actually one of the richest fertilizers because it's super high in nitrogen. And so people will actually go out and collect bat guano and market it and sell it in, you'll see it in garden stores, and people love it for fertilizer. We've even had people, if they have bat boxes in their house, they'll put a collection box under their bat box so that they can collect the guano and they can use it in their own garden. So they're not having to purchase it at a store. The world's largest bat is the flying fox. So those live in the South Pacific. And you can see why they call them the flying fox, because they really do look like foxes. But their wingspan can be up to 6 feet. And so every now and then you'll see there'll be this internet craze of the human-sized bats. And this is actually what they're talking about. They're talking about the flying foxes in the South Pacific. And they're not actually the size of humans. It's just that their wingspan can be up to 6 feet. But they're really cool species. The world's smallest bat is the Bumblebee Bat, and that's found in Thailand. And it's actually smaller than a thumbnail, and it weighs less than the penny. So a lot of variety in the size of bats, you know, from the size of a thumbnail to something with a 6-foot wingspan. So, but in Kentucky, we have 16 bat species that have been documented in here. And like I said, not all of them are typical. Just in case you wanted, you know, this is a list of what those bats are, plus their scientific name. The big brown bat, and I always like to joke around because I feel like whoever named the common name for North American bat species may not have been the most creative. Like the big brown bat is big and brown. The eastern red bat that is very common in Kentucky is got red fur. And the eastern small-footed bat, well, guys can probably figure out it's small-footed. And then as you keep going down the list, you've got evening bats, pretty common in Kentucky, gray bat. This is one that's actually been on the endangered species list for a while, but it seems to be making pretty decent recovery, which is great. Cory Bat, which is just an absolutely beautiful bat. And I've got some pictures and some more information of each of these bats that we have in Kentucky coming up next. Indiana bat is another one of our endangered bats here in Kentucky. Little brown bat used to be one of our most common bats. It is now on under review on whether or not it needs to be a listed species. Northern long-eared bat is another one on the endangered. Rafinesque big-eared bat. Like I said, we're going to show some pictures of these later. These are some really cool species of bat, but Seminole bat, pretty rare in Kentucky, as is silver-haired bat. Southeastern myotis, fairly common. Tricolor bat is another one of those that used to be really common in Kentucky. It isn't anymore. It's pretty rare. It is also under review on whether or not it needs to be an endangered bat. And then the Virginia big-eared bat, we're going to talk a lot about that one for no other reason than it's my favorite bat. The bats we have in Kentucky. So federally endangered and threatened bat species. So these are the bats that are federally protected because of the risk of going extinct. We've got 4 federally listed bat species in Kentucky: the gray bat, the Virginia big-eared bat, the Indiana bat, and the northern long-eared bat. All of these species depend on a variety of habitats for roosting, hibernating, and or foraging. including forests, caves, and clean water. One of the things that's really neat about our bats in Kentucky is the variety of habitats that they use. I think a lot of people always assume bats are in caves year round, but several of our species, Indiana bat and northern long-eared bat, particularly that are federally listed, actually use caves in the winter, but in the summer, they move into forested habitats and they roost in trees. And so just to talk a little bit, kind of get you guys familiar with the bat species that we have in here in Kentucky. So this is the Virginia Big Ear Bat, and this one is by far my most favorite just because it's so stinking adorable with its big ears. You can kind of see this is not a very common bat. It's pretty limited to a specific area in Kentucky, and then a little bit into West Virginia, Virginia, and actually Tennessee and North Carolina. Those are pretty new. We didn't actually know we had them down there until a couple of years ago. What's really interesting about this is in Kentucky, the species inhabits caves year round, and they kind of use these really cool cliffline habitat. So you guys are familiar with the Red River Gorge and kind of what that area looks like. In Kentucky, that's where we find this bat the most. It roosts in that kind of cliffliney habitat that's so characteristic of the Red River Gorge. But when you get down further south into Tennessee, instead of roosting in caves and cliff lines, they're actually found roosting in trees, which is something that we have not documented them doing in any of the other states. They're a big moth eater, but they will mostly eat other insects as well. This is a species that, for a while it seemed like it was doing pretty well. And then it seems like a lot of maybe the recreational pressure at the Red River Gorge is starting to have an effect on it because, despite there not being a whole lot of disease or, direct impact to the caves, these numbers are starting to dwindle. And not just in Kentucky, we're seeing it in West Virginia as well. And that's also a pretty heavily recreated area. So this is one that we're keeping a really close eye on. And we did just finish about a week ago doing our winter count for this species. And it seems like it was up a little bit this year from last year. So that was good news. This is what Virginia Big Ear Bats look like when they're roosting in the winter inside the caves. So they are just in these huge clusters on the ceiling of caves. And hopefully you guys, I don't know if you can tell from these pictures, but the one in the upper right corner. So when they hibernate, they actually roll their ears up like little ram horns kind of, or like little Princess Leia buns from the original Star Wars. And so when they're sleeping in the caves, they roll these ears up. And when they hear noise, they can actually unroll one ear to kind of turn it and listen around, or they can unroll both of them. So it's always fun to kind of go in the cave and see their little ears rolled up. And then when they know you're there, they've got that little one that unrolls and is kind of, moving around, trying to hear what's going on. Gray bat. So this is a fun bat to talk about. So these guys, they live in caves year round. And then we've occasionally found them in really large colonies under bridges. Jessamine County has a bridge that's got a huge colony of gray bats that are there in the summer. They're aquatic insect foragers, so they like, kind of riparian corridors along streams and rivers. And you can see they've got a pretty broad range too, though Kentucky and Tennessee are kind of smack dab in the middle of the species range. This was a bat that was in trouble for a long time, and most of it was just because of the destruction. People just kind of used to, if it was a sinkhole or something, they would just throw brush or trash into the caves, or, people would be exploring caves, and they're pretty sensitive. But now that there's been some protection with these caves, the gray bats are really starting to make a comeback, and their numbers look really good. We're going to talk in a minute. I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about white nose syndrome, which has just been a disease that's devastating the bats. But when we talk about white nose syndrome, we're going to have to come back to this gray bat because interesting little tie to white nose syndrome and the gray bat. So Indiana bat is also an endangered bat in Kentucky. And this is one of those species that hibernates in caves in the winter, primarily limestone caves. So find them a lot. Mammoth Cave has a significant population of Indiana bats. All along Pine Mountain in East Kentucky, there's decent numbers of these bats, but they actually move into the forest in the summer, and they give birth to their pups in the summer as well. And instead of roosting in caves, they will actually, they go into like cracks and crevices and under big sheets of loose bark on dead or dying trees, and they roost in those trees. They've got a pretty wide range, you know, from New York, and it goes fairly far west. Again, Kentucky is smack dab in the middle of the range of the species, which means we have some of the largest numbers of Indiana bats in the Midwest. They feed on insects, you know, typically in forested areas, but they'll also use riparian, you know, streams and along rivers as well. And these are just some pictures of what the trees look like, where you'll find these bats roosting in the summer. So you kind of see these dead snags and these loose pieces of bark. They'll get up underneath that bark. Shagbark hickories, they love shagbark hickories because the bark is naturally kind of shaggy in those. This is actually the one on the bottom is a beaver pond out at Fort Knox. And the beavers came in, kind of dammed up some water. When all that water backed up, it killed a lot of the trees. Unfortunate for the trees, but it ended up making fabulous habitat for the Indiana bat. And actually the largest colony of Indiana bats in the US occurs on Fort Knox. I think actually 2 of them do. We have a little ongoing competition with us in Indiana on who's got the bigger Indiana bat colony. And last summer, which is when we monitor these populations, our colony just blew them out of the water. I think we had something like 316 bats come out of one tree, which is just, you know, really cool. A lot of the tank range where Fort Knox used to operate, and, you know, trees would kind of get hit by exploding ordnances or anything like that during training, actually made really great habitat for the Indiana bat as well on Fort Knox. And so they have done, they've actually got an entire conservation area on Fort Knox that they've just set aside for the Indiana bat, which has been great. One of the things that we have done, working with another company and then with Fort Knox, is one of the unfortunate things with the Indiana bat's trees is when you roost in a dead or dying tree, those trees fall down a lot. So if there's, you know, a big storm or something like that, the tree blows down and the whole colony that's roosting in that area will kind of shift to a new area. And then we have to go out and try to find it again to get an idea of what the numbers look like. And so what they've been able to do, and it's really cool. So the biologist that works at Fort Knox was at some sort of, like a trade show or something, and he came across a guy who works on movie sets, backdrops of these movies. And they had been creating, they were basically using this artificial bark to make trees. And in his mind, he thought, well, I wonder if we can use that artificial bark to make artificial roost trees for the Indiana bat. And so they fabricated these kind of large sheets of rubber bark, and then they've got little bits of like mesh wire on the inside for the bats to hold on to. And they wrap them around untreated telephone poles. And we install those in the ground, and it turns out the Indiana bats absolutely love them. We've had hundreds and hundreds of bats using these, not only at Fort Knox, but they're starting to pop up in a lot of different places, different states. And it just seems like because they're a more permanent feature than, you know, a tree that can blow down. One, it's a benefit for the species because these features last longer, and 2, it helps us out because we always know where to look when we're looking for these. This is the northern long-eared bat, and it has a very large range, goes all the way up into Canada. So this is another one that hibernates in the winter in caves and then moves into trees under loose bark in the winter. Its trees are typically smaller than what the Indiana bat uses though. This used to be one of the most common bat species that we had in the state. We actually, probably not the best term for it, but we used to call it the trash bat, because whenever we were out surveying for something in particular, it seemed like the majority of our catch was northern long-eared bats, and you just caught them all of the time. And then unfortunately, like I said, we'll talk about white nose here in a little bit, but it has gone from being the most common bat that we have in Kentucky to one of the rarest to find within, less than 10 years. These bats have a really cool, so where most bats, using their echolocation, they kind of have to forage in more open areas. Northern long-eared bats can actually forage in a whole lot of clutter. So, forest with dense understory, and they're called gleaners. So where most bats feed on insects that are in the air, northern long-eared bats can actually figure out insects that have landed on leaves, and they can scoop in and they can actually pick those insects up off of leaves. And so it's one of the few bats that we have in Kentucky that can do that. So just to give you an example of some of the places that northern long-eared bats live, so you can kind of see the difference between their types of trees and the Indiana bat types of trees. These are really small. It's about 3-inch diameter at breast height. This was actually from a deer rub, an antler rub, and where the tree kind of grew around it. And so northern long-eared bats have been in there. The one bottom center, that's ice damage, and they were in there. We've even had them where there's been like slash piles from timber harvest, and they are roosting in that. At first, they thought that maybe they were in the trees when the trees got cut down, but it turns out that they're pretty opportunistic in where they can roost, and they actually moved into the slash pile after the trees were already on the ground. So just to kind of talk about white nose syndrome. So all of the bats in this picture, these are endangered Indiana bats, and you can see they've got this white fuzzy stuff on their muzzle. And it's a fungus that grows on the bats. It's killed millions of bats in North America. They actually think that it was a fungus that came from Eurasia and was accidentally transported here by humans. And so they think that what happened is a caver over in Europe had it, probably the spores maybe on his boots, and came over to also do a tour of a cave in New York, and that was where it started. So the fungus kind of, it invades the skin of the hibernating bats, and it becomes really irritating to them, and it actually wakes them up in the winter. So it sort of disrupts their normal hibernation. They wake up, they're hungry, they're thirsty, they fly out, and it's like it is outside right now. It's 0 degrees, it's snow, it's ice, and so it ends up killing the bat. They either die of just starvation, or dehydration because water sources and stuff aren't available. That fungus is primarily transferred from bat to bat, but they do know that, if you go into a cave, you can, carry the spores of the fungus with you from cave to cave. And so if anybody's done tours, had done tours within the last couple of years at Mammoth Cave, they used to have these areas where you would like walk across a fungicide to clean off your boots and stuff after you left the cave. So it was first detected in New York in 2006, and it slowly started spreading to the surrounding states. For a long time, it looked like maybe Kentucky was going to be okay. It spread to West Virginia, skipped over us, hit Tennessee really hard. But then unfortunately in 2011, we did document it in a cave in Trigg County, Kentucky. And now we pretty much assume that every cave in Kentucky is infected with white nose syndrome. And just to kind of give you an idea, this is what it looked like in 2006. So it was this one little cave in New York. And, I remember sitting in a bat meeting, and the biologists from New York were talking about how they just never seen anything like this. And, hundreds of bats were just flying out into the snow, and, you'd walk up to the cave and there were thousands of dead bats laying at the entrance. And at that point in time, we didn't really know what it was. We didn't know how fast it was going to spread. But because bats migrate, by 2011, you really start to see it. It's showing up in Canada. It's moved into West Virginia, Tennessee. It's shown up in Kentucky. You know, they've got it in caves just outside of St. Louis. And then this is the most recent. So this is by 2019. And so, you know, all of those little colored areas on the map are counties where white nose syndrome has been documented. You know, it's gone all the way west into California and Washington now. They had kind of hoped that maybe it was just going to be something limited to like the eastern US, but it is definitely spreading. It continues to spread each year. I would say each winter we add several new counties and new states, and you'll see kind of there's this you know, like Idaho and Nevada and some of these areas, we think that it's probably there. It's just in those areas, the location of the caves isn't as well documented. And so they don't really know where to look in those areas. At one point in time, they thought maybe the white nose syndrome that was in the West was a different strain. Maybe it hadn't spread that bad. Maybe it had come over on, you know, some other cavings, you know, a caver, or maybe a bat had hitched a ride on a transport truck or something like that from the east to the west. But it turns out pretty much the strain that's in the west is the same as what we have in the east. And so really it is just a massive spread from where it started in New York all the way across the US. So there are 7 species that have been diagnosed with the disease. So by diagnosed, I mean these are the species that are actually, not only do they have the fungus, but they actually have white nose syndrome where it's affecting their skin and their, you know, hydration, metabolism, all those things. Indiana bats have been hit very hard by it in the Northeast. You know, the Indiana bat population has dwindled significantly. Our populations have definitely gone down in Kentucky, but not near like what they've seen in the Northeast. Northern long-eared bat has been hit hard range-wide. Again, that used to be one of the most common bats we had in the state of Kentucky, and now you can hardly find it. And that's, you know, primarily due to just loss of the species as a result of white nose. The gray bat is one of those where, and this is where the gray bat is interesting. So the gray bat is just a really gross bat. It has all kinds of nasty stuff that grows on it, all sorts of fungus and bacteria and yeast, and its body is just covered with all kinds of really gross stuff. And what they have found is because there's so much of that gross stuff growing on the gray bat, that while the fungus grows on the gray bats, it can never get established enough to actually cause mortality in the gray bat because it's constantly competing with all the other gross stuff that's growing on the gray bat. So it's the one time that, you know, the gray bat being kind of gross with all of its weird skin and fur stuff growing on it has actually kept it from, you know, significant declines as a result of white nose syndrome. Same with big brown bat. You know, we see it in the species and the eastern small-footed bat, but for whatever reason, it's not causing a whole lot of mortality in those species. And people really don't understand why. You know, they used to think that maybe it was related to body size, but the eastern small-footed bat is a very small bat. It's smaller than the Indiana bat or northern long-eared bat. And so it looks like perhaps it could be something that has to do with the species that are not year-round cave dwellers. Because, you know, the gray bat, big brown bat, eastern small-footed bat, those are all year-round cave dwellers, whereas these other species that seem to have pretty significant declines, they're in the caves in the winter, but they move into the forested habitats in the summer. So maybe they're just not as adapted to, you know, effects that could happen during hibernation as some of these species that live in the caves year-round. Little brown bat and tricolor bat, these are also used to be pretty common bats in Kentucky that have had significant declines, and not just in Kentucky, but range-wide. And so these 2 species are currently under review on whether or not they need to be added to the endangered species list due to the significant declines that they've had as a result of white nose syndrome. And then kind of when you excuse me, when you kind of move down the list, this kind of gives a really good idea of why the disease has spread so quickly. There are several species of bat that actually have the fungus, but don't get the disease. Southeastern bat, silver-haired bat, Virginia big-eared bat, eastern red bat, and Rafinesque big-eared bat. And a lot of these bats are migratory. And so while they might not be infected with fungus because, populations of bats, several species of bat can inhabit the same cave, a species that has the fungus on it that may not actually be affected by white nose can certainly pass the fungus on to a species of bat that is. And so that's just kind of why we're seeing this massive spread across the US. And so these are just a couple, so, kind of talked in detail about the endangered bats that we have in Kentucky, but these are some of the other bats. So this is Tricolor Bat. These guys, you can kind of, they're very small, and they're pretty easily identifiable by the fact that they've got this pink forearm on them. I love them because they think they're a lot bigger than they think they are. And so, they'll bite down on a finger and you barely even feel it. But yeah, this is a species that's been hit really hard with white nose. Same with the little brown bat. Again, used to be pretty common in Kentucky, but it's not anymore. This is the big brown bat, and so big brown bat has the nickname of the dog-faced bat or the bulldog-faced bat, and it's strictly because the nose kind of looks like the muzzle of a dog. And I always like to put this picture up because big brown bats have a fierce set of teeth on them. They actually have double canines. You can have on the thickest gardening glove in the world, and if one of these suckers chomps down on it, it's still going through the glove. And just in case people want to know what this is on its forearm, so that's actually it's a tag, and each state has a unique set of these bands that has whatever agency it's from, and then a unique number. And there's actually a database that keeps track of all of these bands. So we may band one in Kentucky. Sometimes really cool stuff happens, like you go back 6 or 7 years later and you pull out a bat, you've got a bat in your hand that's got a band, and that, it's a bat that you banded several years ago. Or we've had where, bats that were banded in Michigan show up in Kentucky. So it's just kind of a good way to keep track of how bats are moving throughout the US. And it gives us an idea of how long they live as well. This is the red bat, and these guys just have such a unique fur color to them. They're kind of a really pretty reddish yellow, super fluffy little bat. These guys are still very common. They're an interesting bat because they will roost in the most unusual places. They will get down in leaf litter. We've had folks who have gone to put their pool up at the end of the summer. If it's a above ground pool and there are bats underneath the pool. I know on our pontoon boat before, we've unrolled the bimini and there was one in there. And so they just roost in all these really great places. They'll hang from they'll hang from tree branches. And so they're pretty good despite their fur color of blending in to be pretty cryptic. Eastern small-footed bat. I don't really know what to say about these guys other than they're just absolutely adorable. Their faces look like they've got like a little black bandit mask on them. They've got itty bitty little feet. They're only 3.5 inches long, and that's, including their 1.5 inch long tail. So they're super tiny. They're a year-round cave dweller. And then these bats, Cory Bat, their nickname is the Sky Lion, which I think is super cool. And it's mostly just due to the color of their fur. It's this, very brilliant yellow, but then it's got this really cool, like silver tinge to it. These are a migratory bat. They do not get white nose syndrome, but this is the one I think a lot of times when you hear about, wind energy and the big windmills striking either migratory birds or migratory bats. This is one of those bat species that, because it flies so high and it is migratory, it does occasionally kind of crash into the big turbines on the windmills. We do have these in Kentucky. They're not uncommon, but they're not an easy bat to catch, so you don't see them very often. But when you do get one in the net, it's a really cool treat to see. Just kind of to show you how a couple of different ways on how we look for bats. So the picture on the far right, that's what's called a mist net. And it's just this very fine net. We usually try to set it up over where we think flight corridors will be for different species of bats. So they like a canopy cover, because they eat insects in the summer. They like to forage over creek beds, or in this case, this is just a big old rut in a dirt road. And so you set that net up, and when they're, kind of hunting for insects, they can't actually, they don't detect the net all that well. We have definitely had night vision on them before, and you can actually see where they see the net, and then they fly over the top of it. So they know it's there, but I think when they're really aggressively hunting, sometimes they miss it. And so they get caught in the net, and, with good gloves on, and all of us that handle the bats have been rabies vaccinated. You bring the bat out, and we usually, figure out what species it is. We weigh it. If it's one of our rare species of bats, particularly, Indiana bat or northern long-eared bat that roost in trees, you can actually attach a transmitter to it, and it is not painful to the bat. You just shave off a little piece of fur, and using veterinarian glue, like the kind that they do, like liquid stitches with that eventually dissolve, you glue a transmitter onto its back, and you can actually follow the signal. Sometimes we do it by hand, sometimes we do it by plane, and that lets us know where the trees are that those bats are roosting in, so we can, try really hard to make sure that where that tree is, or trees, is being protected. And like I said, you'll also find them in under bridges, and they like these kind of metal span bridges. They'll get in like where there's cracks in the concrete. They'll get up in the cracks of that concrete. Like I said, we've had, hundreds of gray bats under bridges. And then last year, just outside of Fort Knox, we also found Indiana bats roosting in the summer, several hundred Indiana bats in a bridge, which was really cool. So I always like to end on this note, because whether it is in the office or it is my personal cell phone or email, I always get calls about, well, what happens if I've got a bat in the house? So you'll see people who swing brooms at them, or, tennis rackets. They're a pretty fragile little species. And so even a hit with a broom can really damage their wings. And so, kind of what we always say is if you're comfortable with it, the bat is eventually going to get tired and it's going to land. And, obviously don't handle them with your hands, because even though it's rare, bats do carry rabies. And we just always recommend like taking a box and putting it over the top of the bat, and kind of like you do. I don't know if anybody else does this with, spiders, because I don't like to catch them in my hands. You slide a piece of paper underneath it, and then you've got the bat, and you can just take it outside and let it leave. Obviously, if you're not comfortable with doing that, you can always call a local wildlife rehabilitator for assistance, and they'll be able to help you get the bat out of your house. It's rare, that people have bats in their houses, but if it's something that you start to see pretty frequently, there's a good chance that maybe you have a colony of bats roosting in your attic or another portion of your home that you don't access that often. And so at that point, it's usually good to call somebody to have them kind of come in and assess the colony. We don't do that. Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife doesn't do that. That's usually an animal control that will do that. And what they do is they actually, they will go in and they will wait for the bats to leave at night, and then they seal up wherever the bats were coming in, so that, because obviously you don't want to seal it up if all the bats are still in their house, because then you're going to have an attic full of dead bats, and nobody wants that. They do try to wait until, if by chance those bats have pups where they're roosting inside of a house, they try to wait till the time of year when the bats can fly, when the pups can fly, so that all of the bats are leaving. And then that way, when they close it up, the bats can't get back into the house. And it's pretty impressive where bats will find there's way into a house. There's some tiny little areas that they can fit into. And we've also seen people have a lot of success where when they've been roosting in their house, if they put up a bat box and then close off wherever the bats are coming into the house, they will actually shift to that bat box, which is pretty cool. So and that's really about all I've got. I think we can do questions now if that works for you guys, Faye.
Yes, that'd be great. Thank you so much. That was a great
Absolutely. And I apologize. I know I talk super, super fast. So.
No, it was great. And we have a few questions on here, and then anybody that has them now that we've wrapped up, go ahead and just tap them in the type them in the chat box here. But the first question we have is, I heard that the bat guano being harvested for fertilizer was not sustainable because it harmed the habitat. Something like it was beneficial to the bats or other species in the environment. Have you heard of this?
Yeah, so it's definitely one of those things. You can go into certain caves, gray bats are some of them, where there are just mounds and mounds and mounds and mounds of guano, huge piles. I think they've done some like core samples and even deep down into the, core of the guano sample, there's plant matter from plants that are extinct now. And so, yeah, it's not always the most sustainable. I think, what you'll see is it's very specialized, small little areas that harvest the bat guano. And you should be able, usually you can look on the back of the package and it will tell you how it was sustained. But yeah, it's definitely something where, you wouldn't want this huge market of everybody just going into bat caves and harvesting the guano. It's pretty heavily regulated in the US to make sure that those caves and species are protected. So, but yeah, when you're looking for it, like if you see it in the store, you should be able to flip over the package and it will tell you how it was collected and whether or not it was sustainable.
Excellent. That's great information. That was a good question that I was curious about too. So next question is, how do bats feed the pups? How long are the pups dependent?
So, bats are mammals, so they feed their pups via milk. And so what happens is when they give birth, the bats look like little bitty gummy bears. Just like any mammal, their eyes are closed, they're hairless. Depending on the species, they're either already stuck to the roof of the cave, or in the case like the Indiana bat, which is what's in this picture, they're on the insides of the trees. And so the bats are usually, the females usually, start to be born around the end of May. And so we generally consider June and July in Kentucky. That's the period of the time when the bats are dependent on their mothers and they can't fly. And so after July, the pups are able to fly and they pretty quickly start foraging on their own. They are not graceful flyers in the beginning. You can go into a cave, particularly with gray bats, and see where the pups are just starting to fly and they're like crashing into walls and they're trying to land and they crash land. But so usually for the months of June and July, the pups, one, they can't fly, and two, they're heavily dependent on their mothers. And most of the bats form maternity colonies, so it will just be the females and the pups, either in the cave or the tree. And usually, like right around dusk, the females, whether they're in a tree or a cave, will go out. They'll forage for about an hour, and then they come back. And so they're usually gone for about an hour each night when the pups are flightless. It's pretty crazy. A lot of times we'll see right as the females are flying out of the cave, raccoons or possums will start going in. And we do know that they will basically, it's like kid in a candy store. They just let little baby bats off of the ceiling, or snakes will get up into the trees and eat the pups. And so the females try not to stay gone for that long. We have a gray bat cave in Morgan County, maybe, and it has a log over the entrance of it. And we've done thermal imaging where the raccoon comes in and he's actually waiting for the females to fly out, and he's just reaching up in the air and grabbing the bats out of the air as they're flying out of the cave and snacking on them. So we had to cut down that log. And he was a very fat raccoon, so I think he'd been doing it for a while. So yeah, but June and July, usually that 2-month period is about when the pups are completely, basically, they're depending on their mothers during those times.
Great, thank you. Those pesky raccoons.
Yeah.
The next two questions kind of go together, but one was, I would like to put up a bat house, how to attract them. And then the next is, how can I encourage bats in my yard?
Okay, so I always recommend it. So there's a kind of a nonprofit group called BCI is their nickname. It's Bat Conservation International, and they have a lot of really good resources for from building your own bat box to where to place them. The biggest issue is they need some solar exposure. So a big like forested shaded area is probably not going to be great. They need to have that sun to kind of to warm up the box, but also not something that gets direct sunlight, because the last thing you want is a 200-degree bat box in the summer. They're not going to stay there, and so really something that kind of gets morning sun, but it also needs to be someplace high enough that it would kind of deter predators a little bit. So obviously you don't want raccoons to be able to just climb right up it, or cats. And so kind of bigger trees, we usually recommend like north facing so that it gets the sun, and then recommend, just looking at some of the different resources that are out there on that placement. Some of them do great on the side of the houses. If you've got bats that are already roosting in your house, you can try to put that bat box at about the same level and same direction as where they are. I know we had one a couple of years ago where they were roosting. They had a basketball goal attached to their barn, and they had, hundreds of big brown bats behind that basketball goal. And so they actually just stuck their bat box. They moved it just a little bit, and it was on a tree away from it, and they ended up moving onto that bat box. So if you've already got a spot where they are and you're trying to get them away from your house, and putting it in the same direction and at about the same height. But otherwise, like I said, having some of that solar exposure is really key in attracting them to your yard.
Great.
Oh, and I see somebody has them living behind their wood shutters on their house.
Okay, I didn't get to that
Yeah.
part.
Oh, and thank you, Faye, for posting the Bat Conservation website on there. That's awesome. They do love some wood shutters. If you guys ever get a chance to go to Cumberland Gap National Park, the Hensley settlement that's up there, the historic settlement, everything is built out of like shake shingle though, and almost every single one of those cabins has a colony of bats living in it. Little brown, they've got big brown, all different colonies of bats are roosting up underneath it just because they love that wood shingle type habitat.
There was a question about, let's see, do you recommend bat boxes in a rural wooded area, or are trees just as good?
I think they're great because, the one thing with the trees is they're so specific as far as having, kind of the peeling bark. And then you've got species of bats like big brown bats who don't necessarily roost in trees, but they really like houses. And so particularly, I know portions of downtown Louisville and downtown Frankfort is the same way. You've got these old buildings and they all have bats living in them. But, I would say if you've got big older trees that have some of those snags and, peeling bark that you can leave, then that is just as good. But if you don't, and it's more smaller trees or tight bark species, then that would be a good place to put up a bat box. It would give, it would kind of create habitat for the bats that wasn't available to them before.
Great. And then we have another question, which you kind of answered some before, but maybe have something to add to it. But it's, do you have a good resource to check to get bats to roost near your house? Benefits and cautions as well.
Yeah, so I would definitely check out, like I said, the Bat Conservation link that's down there, that's in the chat. And then you can also just, Google bat boxes or attracting bat boxes. There definitely is, the rabies thing is not all that common, but in Franklin County, one of the schools here had big brown bats in their roosting in the attic of the school, and several of them did test positive for rabies. So you'd kind of want to put it at a place where you're not going to have a lot of human interaction or a lot of places where your pets are going to be. And just because, like I mentioned, when the babies start to fly, they're just not very graceful flyers in the beginning. And so, there will be bats on the ground. There will be bats crawling around on the ground. They're guano sometimes. I know histoplasmosis has been an issue, but that's usually only when it's in extremely high quantities. And so, yeah, I don't think you'd want to put it in an area where your pets are going to be frequently, or, where you're going to have a lot of kids around, or kind of high traffic areas, maybe in your yard, kind of maybe on the fringe of your yard or something like that, where there aren't a whole lot of people.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Feel free to unmute if you'd prefer to ask that way rather than the chat box.
Well, I can say I appreciate you guys doing this in February. Usually I get asked to do this in October, during the Halloween evil bat season. So it's nice to be able to talk about them in a context that's not tied to vampires and Halloween. So thank you.
Yes, thank you.
So yeah, and we're about at the time. So we do the winter counts usually in the middle of February, but the bats will start leaving the caves depending on the weather. Usually in March, they start leaving the caves, and by April 1st-ish, they're back into the forested habitat that they will use. So hopefully spring is just around the corner.
Yes, let's hope so. All right, well, I'm not seeing any other questions, just a lot of great information. Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you. And thank you everybody for joining in today.
I appreciate the comment on my enthusiasm. This has been a long road for me. I actually started out in marine biology. So to have been in Florida and doing marine biology to coming back to Kentucky and doing bats was a big adjustment for me. But they really are. They're really cool, interesting species. Definitely we try to, show people they're not that scary. There's actually a lot of cool stuff about them. And so appreciate you guys taking the time out of your day to listen. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge.